Good evening, everyone. I am Anne Kampf. Welcome to Voices of Courage, Whistleblowers, Session 1. This is a personal, independent initiative not affiliated with or sponsored by or representing any institution or organization. It's a space for sharing, learning, and growing together. Most conversation about whistleblowing begin too late. They start with the leak, the investigation, the headline, the aftermath. Um, this session starts earlier, at the quieter, more consequential moment that almost never makes the news. And it is about something that rarely gets airtime. What becomes possible before escalation is the only option left. My guest today is Dr. Mary Gentile. She's the opening guest of this series. Mary is the creator of Giving Voice to Values, a framework that has quietly and fundamentally shifted how ethics is taught and practiced across business schools, public institutions, the military, NGOs, and international organizations in over 1,500 sites worldwide. Her core provocation is disarmingly simple and it changes everything. Stop asking people what the right thing to do is. Start asking how they would actually do it with language, preparation, and strategy in the room, in the moment, inside the system, they are part of it. Giving Voice to Values was launched with the Aspen Institute and Yale School of Management, developed at Babson College, and is now anchored in UVA Darden, where Mary formerly held the Richard M. Weitzer Bicentennial Chair in Ethics. Before that, Harvard Business School, 2 decades of research and a body of work that spans Harvard Business Review, McKinsey Quarterly, Stanford Social Innovation Review, and more. Her book, Giving Voice to Values, How to Speak Your Mind When You Know What's Right, has become a reference point in leadership ethics, not because it offers theory, but because it offers something rarer, a practice. Mary, I'm really grateful that you agreed to join me today. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'd like to begin exactly where your works begin, not with a case, not with a scandal, but with a question about what ethics education has traditionally gotten wrong. You spend you spend decades watching people reason correctly to the right conclusion and then do nothing. The gap is, I think, the founding inside of everything that followed. So, my first question to you, Mary, to start, to ground us, what is giving voice to values and what problem was it designed to solve?
Right. Thank you so much, Anna. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Your introduction was perfect. It was spot on in terms of just the sort of simple twist or tweak that I made to the approach that we use, and it really just came out of my own frustration in seeing what well-intended educators in business schools, MBA programs, and also well-intended managers in companies, and sometimes not well-intended, were experiencing. And it was that we were approaching ethical challenges as if they were entirely a cognitive issue. They were entirely an issue of, first of all, recognizing that there was a challenge, and then secondly, analyzing it and applying the relevant laws and regulations, or if you were in an academic situation, the models of reasoning which came from philosophy, and figuring out what the right thing to do was, the right thing to do. And then we're done. And I began to feel that used poorly, this could become a kind of schooling for sophistry, that people could basically begin to learn to rationalize anything, because we would give them a scenario and we would ask them, how far can you go? Is this over the line or not? Can we just do this? What will happen if we do it? I remember interviewing a gentleman. He was an entrepreneur and a CEO in the United States, where I'm based, and a lot of people said you should talk to this gentleman. He's very thoughtful about ethics and values in business. And he told me the story. He said that he had recently been interviewing for a high potential position within his firm. And he was interviewing recent graduates from leading business schools, and that his human resource department had identified 2 or 3 finalists, and he was doing the final interview before making an offer. And he said he had one gentleman in his office who had just graduated from a top MBA program. And he asked him, "Did you take an ethics class in your MBA?" And this gentleman had said, "Oh, well, yes, it was required." And so the CEO said, "Well, what did you learn?" And he said, "Well, I learned all the models of ethical reasoning, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics. And then I learned that whenever you encounter a values conflict, an ethical conflict at work, you should decide what you want to do and then select the model of ethical reasoning that will best support what you want to do." Now, of course, that wasn't what the professor was hoping he'd walk away with, but it's actually kind of was understandable, because these models of ethical reasoning, by definition, they conflict. They're helpful because they let you see things from different angles, but they don't tell you how to get it done. And what I would see in the classroom is that students would spend a lot of time finding ways to justify doing what was easier or what
Mm.
seemed passable, even if it really was wrong. And so if you actually believe that spending time with your peers and reinforcing these rationalizations, that then you're actually preparing people to find ways to avoid ethics. And so I thought we needed something different. So that was the impetus for creating Giving Voice to Values.
Perfect. We have our first comment from Georgina Halford Hall. Every whistleblower who takes concern outside of their organization is a failure of the organization's process. Mary's advice is helpful in putting into print good practice and gives strategy to help normalize speaking up.
No, well, I thank you for that comment. And my thinking about whistleblowing, often people see the title "Giving Voice to Values" and they think it's about whistleblowing. But I actually created this approach, this pedagogy, because the research about whistleblowing, much to your comment, your audience members' comment, the research suggests that if once people are whistleblowers, there's a high cost to the whistleblower. There's a high cost to the organization, because they've already gone pretty far down the road to creating some sort of problems. There's a high cost to whoever the victim of their bad practices are. And much of this is harder then to come back from. And so what I really wanted to do was to find a way to change the conversation within the organization so that people could raise these issues more effectively. And that
Mm.
doesn't mean simply reporting, because reporting is kind of like internal whistleblowing, I'm not saying you shouldn't have reporting or shouldn't have whistleblowing. I mean, sometimes they're necessary. Lives are at stake, time is short, or there just is no receptivity. But what I was seeing from the conversations I was having with practitioners is that there were a lot of things you could do before you got to that point that might help you avoid that. And so that's really where I'm focusing.
Yeah. What strikes me most about that shift is how much it changes the role of the person facing a difficult situation. It moves it moves them from the analyst to actor. It stops asking them to be right, and it starts asking them to be, in a certain way, effective. And this is a very, very different demand.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. People will always often talk to me about giving voice to values, and they'll say, well, what you really need is moral courage. And I always say, well, I like courage. I'm in favor of courage. It's a good thing. But for a lot of people, it feels like a very high bar. And I think what I was experiencing in the classroom and in companies when I spoke candidly, when people were honest with me, they often felt that it was kind of too high a bar. They would disqualify themselves from being able to do that. And what I always say is, what I really want to develop with giving voice to values is moral competence, so that people are more capable to do this, are more skillful at it, are more confident, are more likely to do it. What I'm trying to do through the pedagogy that we've developed is to develop a kind of habit. I call it, developing moral muscle memory, so that this happens more naturally. I have a little story. I gave a talk once where there were, maybe 100 people in the room. And while I was speaking about giving voice to values, there was one woman in the back of the room, and I could see her face. She was just getting tenser, and her face was getting red. And so I knew she was having a strong reaction. So as soon as I finished, and I asked, "Are there any comments?" Or her hand shot up. So I called on her, and she said, "Well, I just think this is stupid." And I said, "Okay." I said, "Could you say a little more?" And she said, "Well, I don't need giving voice to values." She said, "I always voice my values." And then she paused, and then she said, "Nobody ever listens, but I always voice my values." And it was a perfect setup to get to the point you just made, which is that if all you want to do is to feel righteous, well, then yeah, you don't need this. But if you actually want to be effective, if you want to make an impact, then maybe this would be useful.
Yeah. We have another comment from Georgina. I agree. It is important that people have the skills and confidence to discuss concerns. Correct. It's important that we learn these skills from a young age.
Mm.
Yeah, that's very important.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the field that I come out of, which is academia. A lot of times, people. I mean, I agree with Georgina's comment that it's very important how people are raised, and and supported, reinforced, for acting on their values and for speaking their values and for knowing what their values are. But I also know that in an academic setting, and even sometimes in a corporate setting, people will use that true statement that Georgina just made as an excuse for saying, therefore, it's too late to try and have any impact now. And so, what I always try and point out to people is that we know from the research about child development and adult development that yes, when people are children is very formative. It's called the critical period. It's a very
Mhm.
formative era. But also, we know from the research on adult socialization that once you get into adult context, group context, primarily social context, that has a huge impact on you as well. So, for example, you may have learned at your caregiver's father, mother's caregiver's knee when you were a child, you might have learned that honesty was important, but you probably didn't have a discussion about specific special purpose entities, and various kinds of financial transactions. And so things become more rarefied. It's a different vocabulary. You're surrounded by people who are saying these are specific kinds of situations and contexts. And it starts to have an impact on what people see and how they see it. And they don't necessarily understand that it may be in conflict with those core values that they learned as a child, which is why it's really important to have this experience, throughout one's life, and to use examples that are relevant to the context you're in at that point in your life.
Mm. What actually changes for a person, for a conversation, or for an outcome when we stop asking what is the right thing to do and instead ask, how do I get it done? What changes?
Yeah, it's very important. I mean, it's not that I'm suggesting that we shouldn't think about determining what's right. Some issues are complex, and it's important to think them through in a rigorous and consistent way. But it's just we stop there. And so
Mm.
when you then add that second question that doesn't typically get asked, how do you get the right thing done? It actually can begin to change the way our brains are wired. What we've learned from research, especially the research from behavioral ethics and some of the social psychology research, is that when people confront values conflicts, they typically don't sit down and make a pro and con list or ask what would Confucius say or what would John Rawls say. They don't usually do that. Instead, we tend to act automatically, emotionally, even unconsciously. And then we justify post hoc after the fact why it was the right thing to do, or maybe why it was the only thing we could do.
Mhm.
And we don't do this because we're trying to be evil. We do it, it's an automatic response because we want to protect ourselves from the pain and the cognitive dissonance of knowing something's wrong and doing it anyways. And so instead we find this way to automatically rationalize, automatically. So when I ask, how do you get the right thing done? It's a pedagogical approach. I still use cases. When I was at Harvard, I used to run their case writing program. I think case examples from specific real organizations and real functional areas are very powerful. But my cases are different. Instead of ending with someone who is trying to figure out what's right, they end with a protagonist, a main character who's already decided what they think the right thing to do is. And the question becomes, how could they get it done? And the reason I do that is because I don't want to say, what would you do? And then people reinforce that
Yeah.
self-rationalizing experience. I want to ask, I want to rewire that connection in
Mhm.
their brain. And so instead, I'm asking, what if you were this person who's made this decision? How could they be effective? And it frees people up because it brings the emotion down. It's not quite as threatening. People feel freer to be more creative, and they start problem solving. And I've seen this again and again. I remember I was working with a group of financial managers in Singapore, and we were using some scenarios around kinds of ethical issues that came up with people who were managing the portfolios of high net worth individuals. And so I'd given a talk about giving voice to values, and then we were going to move into some case examples. And after my talk, there was one gentleman in the room who kept asking very combative questions. He was really pushing back on, is this really possible? You can't really do this. It's not feasible. And he was clearly very smart, very articulate, And so I answered his questions, but he was quite skeptical about the whole thing. And then we went into the case examples, which are these thought experiments. And what was interesting is because I asked a different question, he was the one in the room who came up with the most creative
Mhm.
approaches to getting the right thing done because he was applying all that intelligence and all that creativity to a different question than he normally would have been using all that intelligence to explain why you couldn't do it. And instead he had to, because it was the assignment, he had to apply it to how could it get done. And that just shifts something fundamentally in people's brains. And it also shifts the experience for the rest of the people in the room because they all know who he is. They all know that he's skeptical, and yet he's coming up with these really creative solutions.
I think what you, from my perspective, what you do, it's a pattern interruption,
Yes,
and you force them to see the things from a different perspective, because under pressure people tend to default to their um, factory settings.
right,
um,
right.
Before we go further, Jack has also a comment. Growth mindset is key.
I totally agree. I mean, what I'm trying to do is to create these opportunities for people to rehearse and to practice and to create, as I said earlier, this kind of moral muscle memory, this response where they automatically believe it's possible and start to think of creative solutions. And so it means they need to be open to develop and to change. The other thing that I think stops people, and it's just kind of the opposite of a growth mindset, is what I would actually see in corporate settings or in classrooms before I had developed giving voice to values, which is that when we would bring in scenarios, ethical challenges, um, often people felt a little uncomfortable arguing that you should do the right thing, the ethical thing, because they felt like they might seem naive. They might
Mm.
seem, that's impractical. They might seem like people who had never been in a real organization, and they didn't want to position themselves in that way. And so they wanted to seem savvy. They wanted to seem sophisticated, and it seemed safer to put forth a perspective that seemed to be consistent with whatever the organizational pressures were.
Yeah. What you are describing is the space between knowing and doing is something uh, I encounter often in conversations or in this series. People knew, and yet, um, so I'd like to go there now into the forces that keep people from acting, even when they already sense what's right. Um, One of the things your research surfaces, from my perspective, after I read the book, so is that silence in organizations. The silence is rarely a character flow. It is almost a rational response to a set of signals, formal or informal, that tell people what is safe to say and what isn't. Those signals don't need to be explicit to be powerful. Why, Mary, why do people remain silent even when they know something isn't right and even when they believe in the organization they are part of?
Right. Well, so there are many different reasons. You've kind of alluded to some of them already, that there are both explicit and implicit incentives, to go along with whatever seems to be the prevailing style and approach in a particular organization. But I also think that it kind of those things can be manipulated. Those things can be used in different ways. So, for
Mhm.
example, if it's an organization that is promoting a lot. So a lot of the companies I go into, they'll have a set of what do you call it? A code of ethics, a code of conduct, and a code of or their set of principles or values. And they'll often have something in their set of principles like being pioneering or being entrepreneurial. And they're usually thinking of that in a fairly narrow sense. But you can use those same kinds of values or commitments in the service of ethical behavior or values driven behaviors. It's teaching you the language that you need to use to be able to be heard in your organization. And I think too often people limit themselves to a particular kind of connection. I can give you an example. I remember interviewing a woman who was in a very senior position in a high tech company. She was in the C-suite executive role, and she told the story about. She told me the story about how she'd been in a meeting with the CEO and the other C-suite executives, and the CEO had proposed some action that he wanted to take that she thought was clearly over the line, unethical. But he was very excited about it, and everybody else in the room was very excited about it because they could tell that the CEO was excited, because that's one of those things. You asked what keeps people from speaking. Well, if their boss or their superior in the organization is very much promoting something, that's a big factor. So they were all going along with it, and she was the only one seemingly who had a problem with it. But she said she was honest about this. She said, I'm not very good at speaking right there in the moment and arguing
Mm.
with the whole room. And she said, it's just not something I'm good at. She said, what I'm good at is thinking things through analytically, marshaling the data, and doing something in writing that lays out exactly the way I'm thinking. I can't do it on my feet. So she said she basically just was mute. She didn't say anything. And people took a vote and they agreed they were going to do it. And that was the end of the meeting, and that was the end of the day. And she was very worried about this. So she said she went home, and this was back before texting and email. She said she left a voicemail, and she left a voice message for the CEO. And she said she thought about, I know how I'm effective. And then she thought about when have I ever seen my boss change his mind? And so she thought about what influences him. And what tended to influence him, in her view, was when someone had a compelling story, particularly if it was about, one of their competitors, and it was either a success story or a failure story, and that would motivate him. And so she thought, well, I'm not going to be able to do that. But what she did is she went home and she wrote the memo that she was comfortable with, that laid out exactly why this was not a good idea. And then she left a voice message for her boss, and she said, I know we took a decision. So she acknowledged the reality.
Mm.
But there's something that I think you really need to see before we move forward. I only need a few minutes of your time tomorrow morning. So she went into his office the next day. She gave him the memo, and what she felt she could do is she couldn't really verbally, make the case, but she could tell him a story about why he should read her memo. And so that's what she did. And, he read her memo and he actually changed his mind. Now, I'm not going to say that's going to work every time, but what I thought was powerful about her story is that, first of all, she didn't take an initial no as no. Many of the people I've interviewed, they didn't just take no as no. They took it as the beginning of a conversation, and they framed it that way in their own minds so that
Yeah.
they were free to come in and speak. And framing it in that way meant that they were less combative, they were less emotional, they were much more professional and they were able to tap into their most persuasive communication style. And the other thing she did is she played to her own strengths. She knew she was good on paper and with data, but she also looked at her audience to figure out what's compelling for him. And she found this kind of way to sort of address both. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to say to people is, this isn't easy and it won't always work, but we tend to just assume we can't do it. And, there are often ways to make these kinds of impacts. That's what I saw from the interviews I did. But it was rarely a matter of, blowing the whistle or shaking your fist and telling your boss they're evil. It was almost always much more sophisticated, much more nuanced, much more tactical, something that used their communication skills and
Mm.
strategies, and that used the language of the organization they're in. So, when I was at Unilever, one of their values is pioneering. So we talked about this as a pioneering approach to ethics. When I was at Babson College, it's a school around entrepreneurship. So we called this an entrepreneurial approach to values and ethics. At McKinsey, one of their values is the obligation to dissent. And so we said, well, that's what this is about. So, we tried to use the language that works for the context you're in to be able to be heard.
Mhm. We do have several comments that I would like to read from Jack. You can know but be indecisive. How do you crack a balance for prosperity in such a dilemma state?
Do you want me to respond or do you want to read the other comment?
I would read also the other two comments and then I would ask you to respond to Jack. From Georgina, some of the issues arise because of the whistleblowing framework, which are based on legal obligations. These
Mhm.
obligations are time bound and drive blame culture. This is why it is imperative that from the board to the basement, everyone needs to embrace training in communication and the role this plays in problem solving. Most whistleblowers instinctively do the right thing, and most boards appreciate this. Barriers are created by formal and informal legal boundaries, in my experience, normal. I agree with Georgina. Communication, it's it's very important, and oftentimes we notice not only a blame culture but also a complaint culture, and when those two uh, collide, it's not fun and it's not optimal. The next comment is from Vlasta Roshkova. Thank you for bringing this topic, Anne. Very insightful thoughts, Mary. I agree that you should learn how to give a voice to your values to make it effective. However, sometimes there is such a big discrepancy in values, or the other party is not open, of two parties, that we need to be courageous to admit that it is better not to collaborate if not necessary. Conflict is what we do with our values, with burden, our well being, and it's not long term sustainable.
Okay. Is that it? Was there
Yeah.
another? That's it. So those are three different things, but I'll try and respond to them. Um, so the first question was about what if you're not sure? I think that's what that individual was talking about, and if you're uncertain. And one of the things that we talk about with giving voice to values, first of all, there are issues that really are gray, and there are issues where reasonable people of goodwill and intelligence can legitimately disagree. But what we're really focusing on with GVV are those places where this is wrong, this is illegal, it's fraudulent, it's deceptive, it's abusive. You're clear about that. But then we have a set of questions, a protocol of questions that we work people through in order to come up with effective strategies and scripts and arguments and approaches. And those questions actually inherently lead people to see other perspectives, which might, if you really are uncertain, it might actually end up helping you to clarify your position and to really understand what's at stake. But one of the things I would say about that I've learned is that often we think things are gray or unclear because in our heart of hearts, we know it's really going to be difficult to change them, or maybe even impossible. And so it's, again, this kind of self-protective mechanism unconsciously, that we see them as more gray than they may actually be. I kind of learned this when I was doing some work with the United States Army. They have a program for character development and leadership. This was years ago, and before our current administration. And the gentleman I was speaking to had been working in this area for quite a while, and he was saying how it seemed that every year there were more issues that people were defining as gray, as unclear. And one of the things that we came to recognize in our conversation is that some of them really were unclear and gray, but some of them were just because people really didn't feel like it was possible to do anything about them. So it was, again, this self-protective thing. So I would say, if you feel it, there are a lot of things you're going to be certain of, but working through our protocol, if there's a problem, you'll start to see it. But if you're other places where you're uncertain, work through the protocol anyways, because you'll begin to understand that maybe your uncertainty was because you were unsure that you could act effectively. So that's kind of the first question. The second question was talking about legal obligation, and it wasn't really a question. I think that Georgina was
No.
just there was a need for training and communications, and I couldn't agree more. And that's really what GVV is all about: is giving people this opportunity to create this, as I call it, moral muscle memory, to create this new habit, to practice with their peers how to raise these issues, and to even hear themselves and each other raising these arguments, so that it feels more natural and it comes more naturally. So I would simply agree with that. And then I think the last comment was that, important as this all is, that there may be times when it really just isn't possible. And what I always say to people is that this isn't easy, and it is not always possible, but it's important, and we can get better at it. And I think by developing this skill and this practice and this habit, we're actually making it more likely that we can do this, and probably expanding the area of what we think is possible. Because a lot of times we view things as impossible simply because we don't see a way to do anything about it.
Mm.
You know how when you give a talk, people will often end by saying, so what's the one thing you want people to remember? And what I often say to people is that I want them to realize that they probably have more choices than they think they do. And so, yes, there are times when this is not going to be feasible. But if you give up too soon, we miss those opportunities where it can be possible. It just needs to be approached in a very sophisticated and nuanced and sometimes long-term process. Some of the cases that we wrote for our curriculum took people, you know, many iterative steps in order to actually have the impact that they wanted to have.
Mm. You've written about what you call reasons and rationalizations.
Yeah.
The sophisticated, often genuinely reasonable sounding arguments people construct to justify inaction. And we spoke about this also at the beginning of the session, kind of. What makes them so effective is that they aren't weak excuses. They are usually partially true, which is precisely what makes them so difficult to see through.
Hmm.
Um, how do power dynamics and role expectations quietly signal what people feel they are allowed to say, and how does that signaling happen without anyone ever having to say it directly?
Right, right. Well, so it's interesting that you put it in the context of reasons and rationalizations because these are from the interviews that we did and the stories that we gathered. These are the kinds of objections that people tended to hear over and over for why they couldn't act,
Mm,
or why what they were suggesting was not feasible, or even maybe it's saying it's not even wrong. And the kinds of things we would hear are, this is standard operating procedure. This is the way it's done in this industry or in this company or in this part of the world. Um, it's not material. It's not a big enough deal to worry about. Another one that gets directly to what you're saying is, we call it locus of responsibility. It's where people would say, you know, this is above your responsibility. This is above your pay grade. Leave it to me. I'll make the decisions. You just do what we tell you to do. And then the last one we hear a lot is, we call it locus of loyalty, where people would say, you know, aren't you loyal to, you know, your company, your boss, me, your colleagues, your customer, you know,
the
whatever
company values.
the company values. Exactly. So those were four that, I mean, there's others, but those are the ones we tended to hear most often, and they're very powerful. I mean, you can hear just as I say them. If someone says that to you, it's very difficult to come up with responses in the moment. But we also realize is that powerful as they are, they're not bulletproof. But it does take practice. It takes anticipation. It takes rehearsal to think about how to break through those kinds of arguments. You know, and the reason they're so powerful is because, as you say, partly there's some truth to them. If someone says this is standard operating procedure, it might be. You know, I mean, you may be in an industry or in a part of the world where there is a lot of corruption, you know, and so to pretending that's not true is not helpful. You know, so there may be some truth to them, but it's also can be the case that if that's how an organization has been operating over time, it becomes very challenging to sort of undo that, and it's very threatening. It's you know, threatening to a lot of individuals and to the pattern of the organization. You know, the other challenge is, you know, threatening if you're going to disagree with someone who is your boss. That's a very challenging thing to do. So some
Yeah.
of the examples we have in our curriculum are of people who found much more sophisticated ways of raising those issues. I think one of my favorites was a, I can tell the whole story if you like, but the bottom line is that this individual, when her boss was asking her to do something that she thought was clearly clearly wrong, unethical, and probably illegal, she 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 decided, rather than saying to him, no, no, that's unethical, she decided to say, I'm not able to do that, but here's what you can do instead. And what she did is she reframed, she decided that her boss was not invested in being unethical. He was invested in getting through a difficult, challenging situation. And so she decided that rather than just being the source of no, you can't do that, instead she solved his problem, but in a very different way. She solved it in an
Mm.
ethical way. She gave him a different solution that was not deceptive, that was not fraudulent. And so he kind of knew why she was doing that, but she was positioning herself not as accusing him, but as helping him. And so a lot of that is kind of what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to put people always in the position of being about thou shalt not. We're trying to help them find a way to position themselves as on the side of the organization and its success, or their manager and their success, or their colleagues and their success, but doing it in an ethical way. So that's how we sort of try and twist that. I can give you an example if you like, but
Yes,
that's
please do so.
would you like an example?
Yes, 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 please. I think also the audience is
So
curious. So
I was alluding to was a woman who was working in a firm that managed the portfolios of high net worth individuals. So it was an investment management firm, and she was new in the job, and her boss came to her one day and said, "I have a meeting this afternoon with one of our clients." This client was a wealthy elderly gentleman, retired. He was based in Spain, I believe, and he had made his money through clothing, a chain of clothing stores. He's now retired, and his portfolio was what he hoped to leave for his grandchildren. But he himself, although an effective businessman, was not a very sophisticated investor. And although he was wealthy, he wasn't at the level of the high net worth individuals they typically managed, but he was a friend of one of the senior partners, and so they had taken him on. So, anyways, this woman's boss came to her one morning and said, "I have this meeting this afternoon with this gentleman in Europe, and his portfolio has significantly underperformed the benchmarks that we set for this last period. So what I want you to do is to pick a different benchmark that makes it look like his portfolio did better than it did, and create a set of PowerPoints, a deck that I can, and talking points that I can use for this meeting, because he won't know the difference. He just isn't that sophisticated." So she didn't feel like this was something she wanted to do, but she had the fear, and she checked with a colleague. She said, "I'm not crazy, right? This isn't right." And the colleague said, "No, no, you're not crazy." But she realized that if she said no to him, not only would she be messing up her relationship with her boss, and she was pretty new in the job, but also he would probably just ask one of her colleagues to do it. It wouldn't really protect this investor. Now, if I were teaching this case, that's what students, might come up with and say, so it's really impossible to do anything because you're not going to help the gentleman, anyways, and you're just going to mess up your own situation. So, but what she decided to do, and in a GVV case, we wouldn't ask, what would you do? We would say she knew she wasn't going to do this, but how could she enact that successfully? So what she did is she went to her boss and she said, "I don't have time to create a convincing alternative that like the one you asked for. But," and that's the argument people usually use for doing the unethical thing. They say, "I don't have time to change everything to make it ethical." But
mm,
she used it to defend not doing the unethical thing. And instead what she said was, "But what I can do, and what I have done, is I created a set of PowerPoint slides and talking points for you to use with this gentleman that explain exactly where we went off track and what we're going to do next period to address it." So she basically scripted him. And so he wasn't thrilled, but he said, okay. And he shared it with the client. And the client, of course, wasn't thrilled, but said, okay. And that went on. And so the issue was that she managed to change the behavior in a direction of honesty, but to do it without telling her boss that he was evil or unethical, and to do it in a way that, as I said earlier, she tried to solve his problem, but in an ethical way, because he was just really worried about delivering bad news. And
yeah,
she gave him a script. She gave him security and comfort, and how to do it in an effective way. And sometimes when I teach that, people will object and they'll say, "Well, she never told him that it was wrong." And what I would say to that is, he probably knew why she didn't want to do it, but she allowed him to save face, and she presented herself as someone who wasn't against him. She was trying to support him and to enable him to get through what he needed to get through, but in an ethical way. So she positioned herself as on his side. So that's kind of, one of the kinds of things that we'll do when we share this kind of work.
Hmm. Is it? That's a very insightful story, and it's again a proof that people under pressure react differently. Um,
Yep.
Something that comes up consistently when we talk about whistleblowing or speak up is the cost of compliance first thinking.
For what?
For compliance,
Oh,
compliance first thinking. When ethics is reduced to rules, reporting channels, and enforcement, something essential disappears. The space for judgment, for conversation, for the kind of early intervention that doesn't require escalation. And once that space closes, the options remain are far more costly for everyone. Um, what is typically lost when organizations rely primarily on compliance mechanism rather than building the conditions for early voice? And what does that loss cost them in practice?
yeah. I mean, in a way, you've already answered that question, because if you're relying only on compliance, it means you kind of have to wait until something has gone horribly wrong before you can do anything, right? So you've already the horse is out of the barn, as they say in the, here, and so you already have created circumstances where the damage has been done to whoever was the victim of the behavior. The company is being hurt because even if in the end they are prevail in defending themselves, they have to exert resources and their reputation can be affected. The individual who reported the issue has positioned themselves in a way that often feels very vulnerable and makes them in some organizations means that they will either be sometimes there's retaliation, sometimes there's simply just a
Mhm.
lack of trust. It's just not good all the way around. But part of what we and the other thing is that it suggests a very legalistic approach to values and ethics. And so it's all about, as I was saying earlier, the things you can't do, the lines you can't cross, the thou shalt nots. And one of the things I learned from working in an educational context is how can you act ethically and effectively and successfully, as opposed to all the things you can't do. You're actually appealing to something that's much more consistent with your employees and your management's own sort of orientation. The other thing is that I think that I remember when I started sharing giving voice to values in companies, sometimes sometimes I was invited in by their GC, their general counsel office. Sometimes I was invited in by the CEO or their leadership development people. Sometimes I was invited in by their ethics and compliance people. But sometimes the ethics and compliance people were the most skeptical of what I was doing because what they felt was that somehow this was going to undermine their work around compliance and complying with the various legal and regulatory obligations that they had to comply with in order to feel like they were doing their job. And so one of the things that I remember working with a very large multinational company, and their head of global ethics and compliance was quite uncomfortable with when they wanted to bring GVV in for a training. And it was actually their leadership development people who brought me in rather than the ethics people. So we invited the ethics and compliance director to come to sort of train the trainer program that we were doing with GVV in Africa, actually, that then the folks in the training were going to share it with the rest of the organization there. And when she started to understand what this was, what became clear, and she then invited me to meet with all of their global ethics and compliance people, she realized that this actually expanded the role of her team to be not just the monitors, not just the police people, but rather to be in a situation where they could play a much more constructive and active role in coaching and in enabling people to raise these issues before the organization got into trouble. And they also realized that they were getting better intelligence about what was going on in the
Mm.
organization because they positioned themselves as the kind of people that, you don't wait until there's something that where there's an obligation to report it. You wait, you hear about things when you think maybe they're going in a direction that's going to become a problem if we don't stop it now. And so they could be more effective in that way. And so once they started to recognize this, they realized that it kind of enhanced their role, but it was in a different direction. It didn't mean that they didn't still have the legal obligations. They work in a governance structure where they have to comply with the relevant laws and regulations. But it meant that they can be operating in a more sophisticated way with their workforce.
Yeah, they created the conditions for the others to do that and for them to cooperate and communicate better.
Yeah, yeah. There's one other thought that I thought was maybe important to raise. It sort of came up earlier, but this idea that sometimes I forget who it was who raised the issue that sometimes it just might not be possible to raise these kinds of issues in a particular organization. And a lot
Right.
of times when that happens, it's because of people's sense of what senior leadership is committed to. And often I'll hear people say, "You can never do this unless it comes from the top." And of course, it's important to have things come from the top, but it doesn't mean that there's absolutely nothing. And so I wanted to just share an example when I was doing some train the trainer work with an organization, and the company had asked me to come in and train a bunch of high potential middle managers so that they could then go out and share GVV throughout the organization. But they had said, but before you do the training of, the train the trainer sessions, we want you to meet with senior leadership just to let them know what's going on and what GVV, what giving voice to values is. And so I said, okay. But then a week or two before I was set to leave for this organization, it was not in the US, they called me back and they said, we've changed our mind and we want to actually include the entire senior leadership in the training. So, anyone who works in this field knows that that's kind of rare and it's kind of what you want. But on the other hand, it was kind of frightening because I wasn't really sure how it was going to work. What was really interesting is that, we did a variety of things, online trainings, in-person trainings. But when we got to the giving voice to values scenarios, we put all the middle managers at their own tables with situations that we had identified that were relevant to this company in this part of the world. And their job was to figure out how can you get the right thing done. You're the middle manager, you know what's right. How can you communicate this in an effective way? Then we put the senior leaders at their own tables, just with each other, not with any of the middle managers. We gave them the same scenario and we asked them, how could someone bring this to you in a way that would make it easier for you to respond appropriately? So we weren't casting them as the villains. We were
Mm.
actually asking them to say, what would make it easier for you to do the right thing? And so when we brought them together to do the debrief, they just started naturally engaging in this kind of social contracting where the middle managers were saying, well, if you did these things, it would make it a lot easier for us to bring this to you. And the senior leaders were saying, well, if you did these things, it would make it a lot easier for us to hear you. And they ended up creating this kind of social contract with each other, where they mutually committed to different behaviors. And so I think that's important too. We often just assume we have no control over senior leadership, but sometimes it's a matter of figuring out what will enable them um, to do this in a way that's going to feel less threatening and more feasible.
Mm. I think it's also important to have a good and experienced facilitator when
Say it
putting.
again. I didn't
Uh,
hear you.
I think it's also important to have good and experienced facilitator,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
When you put the people together to discuss those things.
Right, 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 right. And you have to position, you have to frame. I mean, they had gone through an online program together. They'd gone through an in-person discussion with me and my colleague before we got to this point. So they were all kind of coming in with some certain shared understanding, which made it
Mm.
easier as well.
Yeah, we are reaching almost the end of the session. But I still have two questions for you, Mary. And actually, I do have more, but I would like to ask you at least those two questions.
Okay.
Um, what gives you hope when you look at how people are engaging with courage and values today in organizations, in institutions, in the people coming into leadership now?
So I am probably constitutionally, very stubbornly, relentlessly positive, which doesn't mean that I think everything's great or that everything's going to be great. I just insist on working toward that, So some of this is just how I'm wired. But what does give me hope is that when I ask the right questions, people come up with answers that I don't know, that I could never have come up with. And so what gives me hope is that I speak to lots of audiences that are not my peeps, they're not, it's not my world. I speak with the military, I speak with police, I speak with the International Atomic Energy Agency, with the UN, with different groups that I main, and with corporations, large and small, and in different parts of the world that I, don't have a lot of experience with. And because GVV has now been shared on all 7 continents, and so what gives me hope is that people will come up with ideas that I would never have been able to come up with because I don't have their knowledge and experience. And so I think it's really important, especially when you're talking about something like ethics and values, that you're not coming in as if you know what's right and how to do it. But you're coming in with an ironclad belief that it's important to try and that we can probably get better at this, and I find that that inspires people. It gives me hope when I share giving voice to values and they feel hopeful themselves because they feel like, oh, maybe there is a chance to do this. So those are the things that make me feel like it's hopeful.
I think what I'm taking from what you said, it's important to acknowledge the moment, to be curious, and
Absolutely.
take take action, and be curious, and ask questions, because this leads to movement, to creativity, and to better solutions.
Yeah, yeah. It's important not to make assumptions, to be open to see things you didn't expect to see. I remember I was had a situation, it was one of our cases where an individual was working around issues of diversity and inclusion, and she was asked to go in and speak to some senior management in a financial firm in the United States. And so it was, senior partner, very high level, very transactional kind of guy, time is money. And he was very clearly very resistant to talk to her. And so, he, arms crossed, annoyed that he had to spend time with this consultant. And so at one point, he just kind of got fed up and he said, I just think this is all so hypocritical. He said, this company says they want me to, hire a more diverse workforce, but I tried to hire, he said, I hired the first African American man in a senior leadership role a few years ago, and he didn't work out. And I've been paying a price ever since. And so the consultant, was saying, well, she knew what to say to him. She knew she could say, well, if you hired a white man and he didn't work out, would you never hire another white man? And
Mm.
what do you mean he didn't work out? Did he really get the support that other people would get? And I mean, she knew all the potential arguments, but she figured if she said those, he was just going to argue with her. So instead, all she did was she just asked him, she said, so that's really interesting. What was the price you paid? And she really wanted to know. And, and he was like, he sort of just his eyes got wide and he opened up and he said, I've been telling that story for 2 years and no one's ever asked me that before. Everyone just assumed I paid a price. And he said, and you know what? Now that I think about it, I didn't pay a price. He said, I thought I did, but I really didn't. And so just that exchange, he just sort of he let his barriers down, and they could actually start having a real conversation,
Conversation.
And so
Mhm.
sometimes you just need to shift the way the conversation goes in a surprising direction.
If listeners take just one idea into their next difficult conversation, what would you want it to be?
Hmm. Well, I guess I would be the first thing is, as I said before, to not shut down too soon, to accept the idea that you may have more choices than you think. And then I think another really important thing to do is in the conversation to start by asking questions so that you're clear, you really understand where they're coming from, and non-judgmental questions. And then use stories. I find that it's less threatening, especially if you're sharing a story that has to do with a time you learned something, which kind of shifts the dynamic. So it's not like you're lecturing at them, but you're actually showing your own vulnerability and your own need to and willingness to learn. But those are a few things that I tend to start with. And then, of course, you have to pay attention to the specifics. But those I think are good places to start. And then also don't feel like you have to respond to every single thing that gets said. That gets in my way. That's one of my things. If people say things that I think are wrong, I have to take a breath and realize, we don't have to agree about everything. I need to figure out what my focus is here. And so that allows me to be less emotional, to be more patient, to recognize it's not all going to necessarily happen in one conversation. Um, that our goal here is to understand before we influence. You know.
Mary, thank you very much. We came to the end of our 60 minutes.
Ah, that
Thank
went
you for, yeah, it went very fast. Thank you very much for insisting that voice is a skill, not a personality trait,
Mhm.
and for building something that meets um, people where they actually are. Voices of Courage Whistleblower series. It's not about being loud. It is about recognizing how courage often begins quietly, long before escalation, long before reporting, while change is still possible from within. Thank you also to our audience for being here with us live, for their comments and questions. Uh, I'll see you in the next session on Friday, the 22nd of May, same hour, with me and my guest speaker, Sebastian Bzetska, Head of Compliance and Whistleblower Unit of the Federal Ministry of Defense of Austria, who agreed to participate in his own capacity. Until then, I wish you a nice evening, a nice rest of the week, and I hope to see you there and read your questions and comments. Once more, thank you very much, Mary. Thank you to
Thank
our
you.
audience.
Thank you all.